Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode with us, the Lost Signals. Today we're going to do something kind of a little bit different. We're discussing a book, Understanding Comics, but I wanted to kind of put it through the lens of our philosophy and narrative.
Yeah, we're not reviewing it by any means.
Yeah, and kind of like take a look at how it gets to the heart of the comics world. This is a book by Scott McCloud, done in, I believe, 1992, and we're going to be talking about that today. So I'm your host, Steve Ramosi, being joined today by Christopher Morgan.
Good evening.
Scott Thurlow.
And I'm just a symbol of myself.
And Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Your neutral face protagonist.
So, thanks for reading this, guys. It's not like the shortest book in the world, but I thought it was fascinating back when I read it initially, and upon reread now, I still really love a lot of these ideas.
It's a graphic novel about the nature and the medium of such, so it's pretty clever in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're gonna go kind of through chapter by chapter, but I want to give you guys a chance here if you have any initial thoughts that you want to talk about before we dive in or anything like that.
I very much enjoyed a lot of the points. I thought he actually structured it very well because I feel like a number of the initial chapters, first half, had some very interesting points. And then he gets into parts where he's recognizing that he needs to address, like color, for instance, address it, and then kind of is more like, and colors happens too. Or at least he has much stronger points to begin this work with, and which kind of, I feel, peters up. But overall, I did enjoy the writing, again, especially the initial analysis.
I got that similar sense where he presents his core ideas in the first, let's say, 3, 4, 5 chapters, and the last 2 or 3 they're still fine, but they're more than afterthoughts, but not quite as fleshed out as the preceding ones. It's in a funny way, he's also color is a thing in comics anyways, right? But the first the majority of the 70% of it that precedes that is very well done and very well laid out. So yeah, I had a similar impression as in terms of that.
Yeah. Chris, you good, or you want to say anything, or?
No, I'm gonna let what I have to say come when we get there.
Yeah, to the chapters.
Yeah, just to kind of agree with you guys, I was actually going to bring that up myself towards the end here, because it really is the first 4 or 5 chapters he sets up his thesis about comics, or he sets all the scholarly groundwork that, and then I feel the last 4 chapters or so, he's just kind of, for the most part, expounding upon why you should love comics and shit, and yeah, the color thing does feel kind of thrown in there towards the end. I think a lot of that is because he has worked throughout his career solely in black and white. So I don't think he was really thinking too much about color when he was trying to figure out his own definition of what comics are. But let's talk about the first chapter. So starts off chapter 1. He wants to get a working definition of what comics are, and what they are and what they're not. And kind of let the world know right from the beginning that they're more than, what you get in the newspaper or the funnies or these they're not kids comics, can be any, type of literature. And he comes up with this definition after a lot of stumbling around that goes, the comics are a juxtaposed pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, which he quotes Will Eisner pretty heavily in this, and who came before him as one of the first, in fact, probably the first real scholar of comics as a literary form. And Will Eisner called them just kind of sequential art, which was his initial definition. McCloud wants to go a little bit further, but he kind of throws it out there as Yeah, for working discussions, probably all you need is sequential art. The rest of this is just background information.
It's not like his core template that he fleshes out, gets more detailed with, but for the most part, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually appreciate the way he structured the first chapter, because I was coming up with, well, what about film? And then a page or two later, he's like, well, film does meet this definition, but that's why I have to change the definition. And I'm like, I actually really appreciated his witnessing how he comes up with the definition and why some of the more broader definitions don't, or what they capture and what they don't capture that aren't comics. So I actually very much appreciated his methodology with it.
I also like the getting back to film and so forth. I liked his frequent use of he'll mention it so to kind of bring it to the light, and he's like, but I'm going to get back to it later, and he gets back to it later. I mean, I know that sounds like, an obvious thing, but it is also, by the time he gets back to something like, say, film, he's already given you so much information that it's kind of like it's a nice welcome payoff. It's earned. Let's put it this way, you've earned the journey by the time you get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just talking about in terms of the way he constructed the whole piece was
100%. And I love the part, like similar to that part where he's like taking questions from the audience at one point in the pages, and somebody goes, well, what about words? And he's like, well, not all comics have their words. They're like, no, aren't words just juxtaposed images like in sequence? And he's like, oh, well. So I love that. Like, as he had to constrain the definition even a little bit more because he was just describing a page filled with words, like stuff like that. So like he does a lot of this throughout the book of kind of setting up examples for the reader and then saying why they're a good explanation or not for any specific thing he's talking about. But this first chapter is mostly just that, just setting up the definition, his working definition for comics, and saying what they can do.
Before you move on to the second chapter, there is one point of disagreement I have in the first one, but it's actually further to because he brings up kind of the family circus style single, but you could argue that it's juxtaposed continuity over time, over the body of work of an artist. Yes, and that you can. That you're dealing with the body of work of a person. So yes, it's one image alone in that newspaper or the thing, but you can view it as the totality of that work. So I think that he describes it as a cartoon at that point or something similar to that versus not a comic. But I think you can make the argument that it is part of a comic.
And I'm glad you brought that up, dude, because I was sitting there like that was not sitting with me. Like, I don't quite agree with it. And I couldn't. I'm glad you said that because I couldn't visualize that. I'm like, there's something gnawing at me. And I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Scott. What were you going to say?
Nothing, that's all.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know if I agree. But I think that's a really good argument, and I think that Scott McCloud would agree that that is an argument that can be made if you want to call that a comic. I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but it is like, I guess if it was one panel and there was no shared continuity with any other thing, then maybe it wouldn't be, but considering that Family Circus, their history basically, like, all right, if you know Family Circus.
Actually, what's the one where Far Side? Far Side is a comic, but generally the panels have nothing continuous to do with each other. But it's Gary Larson body of work, and that's what uniquely is the feature that identifies it as the Far Side comic. Even though there's no necessarily connective thread between one single panel versus another. And I think that's my argument for it. And again, I'm now arguing I'm not disagreeing with his general thesis. I'm just saying that I can expand his thesis to include all of those.
Yeah, because with the Far Side, they're each they're each one thing. The artist is what ties it together. But as you said before, in the Family Circus, there is a cast of characters.
Like, for example, sorry,
So you are, as Ian said, you're telling this family story over a cumulative period of time.
And yeah, just to add on to sort of tie together in a sense, I believe they might have even done this, or I don't remember who the artist of Family Circus is, but there's probably a collected like volume of all of them sequentially, like consecutively, which would then be its own actually, comic.
Right. I do have like
firms.
Far Side volumes.
Yeah,
certainly not Family Circus because that comic sucks. But
Yeah, I was going to keep the personal taste out of it. But yeah.
Just since we're talking about Family Circus, I saw one recently and it references 2020, and I realized that there's that mother, she's in hell. She is forever. Time passes on, marches along, and she is stuck as an exasperated housewife for her entire life.
left in
It's
the
awful, yeah.
60s or whenever that comic
That
started.
got dark real quick, but goddamn,
Um,
thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, but that's a good point, and I do think that McCloud himself would take that as a good point, and as he says multiple times throughout this book, and if you read like the postscript, he's like, I'm always happy to have people argue with me, and I love that type of scholarship, not the I'm right, but this is a conversation, type of scholarship. But so well said and very good point. Let's move on to chapter number 2, if that's all right with you guys. It's called The Vocabulary of Comics. This is kind of talking about the power of the icon. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see I have a panel I believe it's from this chapter behind me, because I thought it'd be kind of funny. So it's an Easter egg for anybody watching it, not listening. But it talks about the strength of iconography and the scale from like more realistic to more abstract. The more abstract something is, McCloud believes the more widely relatable it is. He makes another point of like de-emphasizing the physical leads to
deep detailed features, right?
Yeah, de-emphasizing the physical features leads to this conceptual understanding of objects, a more conceptual understanding of objects. Breaking down what makes this face behind me human into like its very component structures means that you can put it onto anybody's body and they can see themselves in it. He has this quote from here that I want to read, where he says it's between the like characters and he's talking about between the characters and the backgrounds, and like sometimes they have more highly realistic backgrounds and then cartoony characters that kind of provide this back and forth that the illustration gives. And he says one set of lines to C, another set of lines to B is the line that comes out of that. And it's like, the artist, he's talking about the artist like really giving you the iconography and the something to relate to with the characters, and then something beautiful or like a more detailed background. I think he brings up Mobius in terms of this, and he's one of the best, of all time in there. So, it's just something interesting to think about in terms of why comics artists, make things at, like on the scale of realism why they put them in certain places. And it's kind of, a gut reaction by them as they're creating, but also there's reasoning for it that they pick up. So what do you guys think in terms of that, in terms of like the scale going from more complex to more simple? And what do you think about what he has to say here in this chapter?
Well, I want to hear what he has to say after me, because he's studied, like he's a student of this stuff, but of course I'm interested anyways, right? So I believe Steve-O in that chapter is a very, like, one of the huge splash pages is just like a giant sort of like montage of symbols and stuff, like the no smoking sign, like the hazardous material sign and stuff. He's like, and as we evolve these, what are arbitrarily like, images on the surface, as we impart meaning to them and that meaning evolves, then artists can use them to sort of convey, like, yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, exactly. So if you're watching this, like, it looks like that, right? So like, he just has this huge just sprawl of them. That's like, these are recognizable like things that don't inherently have meaning, but because they have been imbued with them throughout, like at least enough throughout human pop culture history, then they can be used as a sort of shorthand to convey ideas, etc. and stuff. So,
Well, I'm a Phrygian, so I study a lot of like sense and reference when it comes to, and I thought I would love to see his opinion on this, because you like the more concrete a image is, the more it has a direct reference versus establishing the sense that you're trying to build with it. And how like that face behind you, I always have 3 pictures of you, Steve. So but you can implant what you the referent dissolves to allow the sense to allow the person to impart their own reference to it. And it was actually a really I think this is one of the more lasting important parts of what he talks about here. Again, there's actually a lot to unpack here that I don't necessarily think that upon a simple reading, one reading of it, I can do great justice to. But I thought I was floored by his discussion on it.
Yeah, it's really what. So this is like when I started reading comics again, when I picked them back up, this was one of the first books that I read. It really changed the way that I looked at them from that moment forward. I think I read it in college. So
was it part of the curriculum that you took as a course when you were taking it?
Yeah, it was the first book that we read in this comics course that I took, and I'm so happy that it was like put up there. And you know, like I feel like anybody who has any interest in modern literature should read this book, because it talks about the importance of comics in literature space. And in terms of this, it really goes like in terms of this chapter, it really goes hard into the like how much do you see yourself in comics. It's a medium that's not just words, but it is an active medium, unlike TV or movies, which are usually the other mediums pop culture mediums that you check out if you want to see something visual. So comics really can put their character their reader actively into the story, and depending on whether you want that kind of effect or not, may have an effect on how simple or complex you make your characters, or how simple or complex you make your just the world in general. And I think that's like a really fascinating thing about this chapter. And like, this is one that I do always remember, Ian. You're right.
There is an interesting aspect, though, because of the intent of universality. So one of the big things is in movies, they try to have the neutral face protagonist. You have the Keanu Reeves from Matrix, the Luke Skywalker, but where they're trying to make an everyman in order for you to impart onto it. But at that level, though, your universality has a certain limit to it, because it's a white male is not the universal neutral face. It's the universal neutral face for other white men. That face behind you, is it gendered?
I mean, I don't think so.
Do people make an assumption that it's ungendered? That it's interesting to me. Is it a specific, like, the thing is, like, I think there's a habit you can have in where you, in universalizing certain things, you're universalizing your own world to appeal to versus like Cyanide and Happiness. I don't know if any of you follow or have followed. They do very similar art style to this, but they'll have different race, they'll have different genders in there, and because there is a limit to kind of stripping away features, then brings out society's dominant interpretations of it. Yeah,
true.
So I think there's an interesting a whole other philosophical bent you could take with this, but I just wanted to make that point that you can not only can you get the I think Scott McCloud says you can, by stripping away after, you can get the intent of the author, but you also see the views of society.
Mhm.
on that.
Yeah, I think it's a
So-
good point like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Sorry, Chris, were you going to say something?
Well, Trump. First of all, I think this is. I think this book can kind of actually go beyond comics, because the thing is, it's just like a lot of the comic stuff. I mean, as somebody who's been a fan of these things for years, the practical. There are parts about the actually applying it to comics, like the gutters and everything, I thought were interesting, but a lot of it was stuff that I already kind of knew, took for granted. But when he deconstructed something like the iconography and a lot of the points he has, I think this works as a great reference book because it's applicable to so many things. I mean, as a composer and musician, I'm writing in an abstract. Right here in the iconography, it's like, this is not music. No, this is a representation of it. The kanji, I have kanji on my arm. It is both a word and a picture. It means it's katsu, which for Buddhist monks or anybody in martial arts, the ha, whatever that shout is, that sound is katsu. So in other words, it's like I find it's the layered things where it's like, this is a picture and a word for the sound without actually
Multiple
saying
levels
the
to it.
sound. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So when I found this really interesting, not just with regard to its application of comics, but to basically say like, okay, it gives you a chance to deconstruct everything around you. To sound corny, but it gives you a chance to deconstruct the world, even these things that are, all these things we take for granted. So I like the way that I think it was Ian who said the universality
Correct.
of the arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that as well. I think it's really interesting to see how much this does play into other things, but this whole book is kind of like his, like, as he says, like this treatise that he's been working on for 15 years, like art history, like comics history, like philosophy.
I gather he got tired of explaining why what he's doing is serious work. You do comics? No, read my
Here's
book.
why it's
Read my book.
serious
Here it
legit
is.
art. Yeah.
Yeah,
But that's the interesting thing is,
justifiably so.
because of anything else, people who aren't into it either mystify it or some kind of, like he said before, you kind of lower it, like it's
Brush
a
it
kid's
aside.
thing, you denigrate it, and really it's you can take a lot of his arguments, and this is actually, I mean it to be a compliment, and apply it to so many things, which is why I'm like thinking, this is why I said, like, you could definitely take this beyond just his focus on comics.
I think. I mean, yeah, you're right. I think a really interesting and integral part of this chapter actually comes a little bit later on when he maps out the picture plane.
Mm-hmm.
And like seeing that, I remember having seen this for the first time, like when I was 18 years old or whatever, 20 years old, and like the rest of the book making a lot of sense to me. Like I feel like I was almost not lost, but like a little bit out of my depth the first time I read this. And like I remember seeing this and saying, oh, okay, so like you got it all like mapped out here. I have it right here, so you can't see it. Well, Chris,
No,
you got a book.
Yeah, what page is it on, dude?
52 and 53.
Okay. For those of you listening, not watching YouTube, the kanji I showed was a tattoo on my arm, and I'm showing the picture that Steve-O is talking about.
It's called the picture plane. If you need to look it up, you can look it up. But it just maps out a whole bunch of different comic figures and puts them on this plane from reality to
abstraction.
like on a line from reality to meaning, and then with abstraction, the further up you go, it's 3 axis points, and it's, I guess not axis, whatever, you know what I mean. It's a triangle, and like if you get a chance, just take a look at this thing. And for anybody listening, take a look at this picture plane, and I think it's really just maps out exactly what he's talking about. And then he used it a bunch later on to make a lot of other points. But I just wanted to mention that before we even think about moving on to chapter 3, as I had to get that in there.
Okay.
Ian, looked like you might have had something to say. I don't want to.
I have more to say, but I'm waiting for the Barbara chapter before I jump in.
Okay. Anybody else want to discuss anything else in chapter 2?
I think that's good coverage. Like 1 and 2 are essentially like the groundwork he's laying out, and then he's going to build upon that, which we're about to get to. So,
as a person who works in categorization and AI, I actually really appreciate his categorization on different planes. I actually very much appreciated this really, I feel, scientific breakdown of it. And I guess you could organize it in different ways, but I was actually satisfied with how he broke it down, and I'm impressed by it. So,
yeah, absolutely. I thought he did a very good job. All right, so let's move on to chapter 3. This chapter is called Blood in the Gutter. This is actually one of my favorite topics about comics. And probably because of reading this book when I did initially, talking about the gutter as the place for where closure is achieved in juxtaposed images is really like a powerful thing to me. Like when he says the reader's deliberate voluntary closure is comics' primary means of simulating time and motion. That really gets me, like, right? So you are, as the reader, you are the one causing the action to continue. And in fact, a lot of the action is happening only in your head in between panels. And, he uses fairly standard gutters for most of this book. But there are some like really interesting things that you can do with them, and like taking the walls off of the panels, if you will, things like that. I mean, I know he references that a couple times, but he has this part where he talks about the different types of transitions in this chapter, and he goes through 6 of them, I believe. So it's moment-to-moment transitions where between panels not much really happens. It's just like a small change from moment to moment. You have action-to-action transitions, which are, something about to happen and then that thing happening, basically.
punch, boom.
Yeah, exactly. Like one of the ones that he has here is like a pitch coming into a batter and then the batter hitting it on the next panel. Chris, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to, right before that, when he's building this up, he kind of gets into kind of object permanence, like when you play peekaboo with the child, like you close your eyes to show that you're still there, and he equates the covering of your eyes to being the gutter. But like I said, I didn't want to like kind of lose the flow of what you were saying. But by the same token, before we went on, I thought that was one of the points where I thought
analogy, yeah.
Interesting, because I'm like, I had no idea why peekaboo is important to not, like to whatever.
Object permanence.
It's like, yeah, the object permanence thing. And then you take that and you can apply it to this. Like I said, I'll let you get back to your thing, but I noticed what you were saying. I'm following along as you're saying this, as you're talking. So I wanted to make sure I addressed that before we continued on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that is a good point, and I did kind of a little bit skip that part, but that is a really interesting part of this chapter. But let me finish up these 6 here. So I did the first 2, moment-to-moment, action-to-action. The third one is subject-to-subject. So it stays within a scene, but it switches the view of what you're looking at. Okay. So, like it'll go from person to person, and they'll each say something or whatever, what have you. Scene to scene transitions are going, obviously, like transitioning out of a scene into a new scene, something like that, or going to somewhere completely different. Aspect to aspect is kind of within a scene and at the same time, without progressing time, you kind of see a bunch of different little aspects that make up that scene. and kind of tie it together. He talks about this a lot in terms of manga, actually, later on in this chapter, and how Japanese
speak more about that,
artists use it a lot more than American artists. At least they used to. I think
when we
this
get to
is
that,
becoming a
I would like
bigger
to
thing.
speak a bit about it, Sivo. Sorry, but yeah, like that division is an important one I think that he makes and comes back to, as Chris said. He's
Yeah,
like, I'll get back to that later, and he does in like 2 chapters or so.
And the last one is non-sequiturs, which you don't really see very often unless somebody is doing like an underground comic or something like that. But absolutely, you can have them. And he even talks about the non-sequiturs in the page after. He describes all these in a section I really liked, where he says like, look, like you can call it a non sequitur, but nothing is really a non sequitur because your mind will make it part of the story if it's in there. And as he's doing this, he like puts a picture of a fork, like a gun going off, some weird, like lightning shit happening.
Yeah.
So like an Abraham Lincoln talking about a fish. So yeah, I just go ahead. E.
Oh, I just want to say about I meant to mention this in the last one, but this is as good as place as any. There's a great video of a bunch of shapes just moving around, and how the stories people came up with that, and it's hardwired into our mindset that when we see temporal progression of closed objects, we come up with a narrative involving them. And it's fascinating. I believe it was actually an evolutionary perceptual documentary, but you're absolutely right. We will come up with we need to come up with a reason for things to happen.
No, that's perfect, because I was going to mention an amazing segue is that the 2 notes I have the most on, Sivo, about understanding comics is the closure aspect, right? So, like you said, it's a physical / and mental phenomenon that like you can't help but create some kind of continuity when you're presented with juxtaposed images, sequential art, essentially, right? So like it's like hardwired. Like there's no way you can't do it. So that way, in that sense, I mean, that artists who are working in the medium, and like you said, Chris, even beyond it, can use that, like exploit that aspect to create some interesting art and to like make your mind work to connect together. And I just said, well, yeah, like a non sequitur, like essentially is like 2 things that have nothing to do with each other, but they will because you make it happen.
Except in something like a Farsight collection, where it's
each of them is.
If you consider it as a entire embodiment of his work, it's all non sequitur panels one from another. But that's just my theory there.
But you can still create a story, even so. Like,
right? Like even if you're I was gonna say, even if you're looking at that, you could still look at it as like shared universe. So it's more like scene to scene, or like I guess probably scene to scene like transition. Right?
I got them for you. So like, as many as anyone who's read Gary Larson / Farside may be familiar with the fact that he often uses cows as characters, right? To be like, sure, like cows are doing this in this like self-contained arc or little panel, and then is it the same cows like in a different like
is it the same humans being dumb from panel to panel? Yeah,
exactly. Right? Yeah, all I'm saying is like I thought the idea of closure was like one of the most interesting and well done delve into ideas that that Scott McCloud talked about in it. So
yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really fascinating that like how much work the readers do in comics, and like how he talks about that. It's really, there's not another art form like it where you're like making the story. Like you can like imagine other things happening in the world of a novel, but that story is all told to you in words by the author.
May I film cuts in film?
Mm-hmm.
Hitchcock, the shower scene in Psycho. I think they did a thing where it's like, do you see flesh being pierced by a knife during that scene? And everyone's a lot of people say yes, but there was never a single image of and it's specifically made up to have a lot of, I forget, there's a shit ton, which I think is the actual technical term, of cuts in that in a very short span of time. And I think that scene cuts, because they have that too. Like when you watch conversations in like sitcoms, it'll go from subject to subject. I forget what the term is called for it, but you have the face and then who's the other person's face in the conversation. I think again, how films are constructed with the splits work very much like the gutter does in comics.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I think you're probably right on about that.
The same, Ian, the same thing with the scene in Reservoir Dogs with Michael Madsen in the ear. A lot of people they're like, don't show it, and he showed it. I'm like, no, actually, he didn't show it. You just, it's just funny. It's just, I found that interesting too.
Because their mind makes it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why the monster is always scarier before you see it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. All right. Anybody have anything else you want to talk about? Well, I guess we should talk about a little bit about manga.
You're talking about manga.
So yeah, I just wanted to mention, because he talks about that at the towards the end of this chapter, where they in manga they do a lot more. What's the fifth type? Jesus, I just had it. The aspect to aspect transitions, where you kind of just get more of a feel for the scene. They kind of like allow the space for the artist to breathe a little bit more, and you show a scene in parts, as opposed to really having to crank up the action a lot more, like at least at the time they did in America and even in European comics.
But I think aspect to aspect exists quite a bit in film. I think that most Western audiences would be familiar through it from establishing shots in like cities or something like that. It'll do the Brooklyn Bridge, and if we're going back to the 90s, the Twin Towers, and then, we're in New York. And that's aspect to aspect of just building a scene.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I would almost say you get more of that in Eastern films.
Sure.
If we're just talking about films, but go ahead, Scott.
Now, is that I can't remember exactly where you mentioned it, but the masking effect, is that in this chapter, or are we getting to that? Sorry, am I jumping ahead?
That is in the next chapter.
Okay, I'll wait on that then. That's all. Sorry, I just can't remember exactly when he introduced it.
I definitely do have a note for that as well, so we'll definitely talk about it. So let's move on. If you guys have nothing else for chapter 3 to chapter 4, time frames. This chapter is kind of about creating the illusion of time in comics. And there's kind of 3 ways that he talks about doing it. 2 within the frame, and the third is the time between panels in the gutter, which is why the chapter previous to this is a good lead-in. And he kind of talks about how, the gutter time, I'll call it, I guess, is you don't really have a feeling for you can give a feeling for how long it is, but you don't actually, there's nothing on the page.
It's all implied.
Right. Yeah. It's the implication from one panel to the next of how much time has passed. Whereas in terms of the other 2, which are sound, the depiction of sound in the panel and the depiction of motion in the panel, kind of give you a more concrete idea of how much time is supposed to be passing in any given frame there of the book. So I think those are the 3 big parts of this that I wanted to touch on. What do you guys think? Did you have any interesting take from this chapter?
Well, obviously you're a bigger comic fan than I am, so I had to frame a lot of this through other aspects. So I'm going to bring up film again. If any of you remember Game of Thrones from 30 years ago, there was a constant reference about jokes about characters teleporting. Because there was they failed to give a sense of progression of time, and that is actually something that you see in a lot of other works. Not just there is an art to, because you're dealing with scene transitions, state transitions, whether it's a fight scene where you don't know where anyone is in relation to each other, or with characters. How did the character get here so quickly? I needed to have that, just like he had the elongation of that panel to signify a longer period for a character that is thinking about something. You need that kind of because I think our brains are almost have an almost immediacy to them. That an event, we see one event, this event naturally follows it, even if a year has passed or a second has passed. So you need to have some way of signaling to the audience that that there is a. That's why that 2 years later, things are necessary.
That's so good. Yeah, I was going to lead into that. Like, it's again perfect segue, because of course, in general, you mentioned at the outset, like, Steve-O, how to provide the illusion of time already is an illusion. At least I will espout that forever, pretty much. But of course, like, sort of meld it into this art form, right? So, like I just said, I think any human's natural instinct, without any other indication signifier, right? You're going to assume that it happens like immediately, like, in seconds or less, right? If you're presented with an image or a sequential number of them.
Also, again, to bring the pieces of the metaphor, I think is that in the Game of Thrones, the first season, much of it is about the length of time it takes to travel from Winterfell to King's Landing. It takes half a season for them or to get there. Yeah. Then you have characters taking that in one episode.
Right. And it's jarring.
And without a change of seasons or anything like that, or a referent in reality that we can attach to, it seems like, wait, what took one character this long? Why is it, even though theoretically in the abstract it's taking the same amount of time, we have almost that the scene transit takes precedent.
You can like sort of mess, like, potentially trip your audiences up without, like, constant and meaningful signifiers of that sort of transition. But so I guess my other big point is that I had about this one, I was waiting for you to get to this, Steve-O, to this chapter, is that because of, I guess, the nature of how we as humans as a species experience time, then you can use that in this art form to mess with that very perception and create a very different and tell a very different type of story, when utilized correctly.
Actually, or you can manipulate it, like we did Killing Stalking recently. They had a thing where by the sheer amount of scenes that were in there, you felt a lot of time had progressed, and then it cuts back to the clock, and you realize not much time had progressed. Like, you can mess with and so you can play with your audiences that way as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is, like, interesting, like, seeing little things like that. And you're right about, when you talk about Game of Thrones, and it wasn't necessarily that they didn't, do it right at the end. It was that they had already set up the reality, and then you broke your own reality that you had set up earlier in the show. So it is really important that when you're setting up the rules of a work like this or like that you follow those rules later on. Otherwise, it's going to feel like you're not, you're breaking physics, basically.
Now let's call it pulling out of your ass. Like, let's be clear. Let's be very clear about this.
Yeah.
In that instance is all.
Yeah. And I just wanted to briefly touch on how, so we talked about this and we talked about how motion and sound are two of the things that they try to do in panel to show time passing. Motion, we actually got this, like, really interesting little art history lesson about how the classical artists started trying to work on stuff like this, like getting motion into their paintings and art, and then kind of comics artists kind of picked it up from there and did a lot of interesting stuff with the depiction of motion in a static, picture, which is always kind of fascinating to me. And then, just having, they have this panel, he has this panel where there's a bunch of people having a conversation, and that's kind of like all right, this is why sound, like, all these people talking, obviously it isn't all happening at once piled on top of each other. So, like, clearly there's some sense of time passing here.
The rope.
But also the fact is that conversation has a passage of time. So as you're reading it, you're largely reading left to right. So more time reading one sentence, and you start implanting in your head that this amount of time required this sentence to be had. Then you read the second sentence, even if it's happening concurrently, it has the feeling sequentially. I thought that was actually a very neat point.
I think that, Chris, give me 1 second because I want to address that really quick, and then I'll let you say what you're going to say. But I think that's really, I think that thing that he, like that example that he showed was really fascinating, because the way I read that as a comic was all those conversations between people were happening at the same time, between those two people that are talking for the most part, with it kind of like being a full din of the room situation. But when McCloud shows them all in their own panels, I read that as they all happen sequentially, one after another. Even though it's the same picture, they're just cut up into panels. I read those ways completely differently. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
No, the one conversation you're talking about, with all the one panel with all the one where he refers to as like a rope, and he's going through the. It's funny because in theater they do that a lot. I was in a high school production of this one thing, and there's a dinner party, and he started like you're reading left to right, and like one, to establish the conversations, it's just like you'll say your line and then you kind of mimic and the next person mimics and everything like that. This is like immediately what I thought of when because like you, Steve, if I see that on the page, I think it's you kind of block that
all at once.
you actually are reading it, and kind of establish that time. I don't know. I thought that was really fascinating as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And then, unless anybody else has anything for this, I just want to mention towards the end he talks about manga again, and just the interesting ways that in Japan they kind of used motion in panel to. I really love this part. It was like they have this subjective motion, right, where it's like the background moves and the main character stays still, so it looks like you're going really fast, like if you're on a motorcycle or something like that. The whole world is moving around your main character because you want them to be the focus of the reader's point of view.
Or was that done because things like what's the Go Speed Racer, where it was cheaper to animate with a static character and have the background going by to represent. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying.
I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but it's even if it was created as like a cheap way to do it, it's still pretty genius, I think.
It works out either way. But no, so you asked I did have a note about that, because I did think it was interesting because I didn't know, or I didn't realize that this was published back in '92. I thought it was a little bit older than that. So yeah, as McCloud says, at the time, sort of the Western/Eastern division between the art form was pretty wide. They were using a lot of different things, but without really talking to each other. There was not a lot of crossover in use of forms and styles, techniques, etc. Right? So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then after the fact, later on, then there was Western comics artists and so forth adapted and started to realize and use the styles from manga and stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm. And manga became a little bit more westernized itself to a degree, right? So I thought that was just a little fascinating, little like you said, Steve, subdivision of art history in terms of this specific art form that was happening near and around the time, and it was really cool to delve into a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like you said, that they have gotten a lot closer in the time since. I think that this was around the time that manga was starting to get big in Western culture, and they had this explosion in the early 2000s. But it has occurred to me that perhaps this book is one of the main reasons why it got a lot more, because a lot of people who were into comics read this book in the 90s and the early 2000s. And he talks a lot about it and the differences, and I'm sure a lot of people will see this and get kind of interested if they're into comics of checking something different out, in the same way that anime blew up in probably the 90s and the early 2000s. Anyway, so that's chapter 4. All right, everybody. This episode ran a little bit long, so we decided to cut it into 2 parts. This is chapters 1 through 4, and chapters 5 through 9 will be coming at you next week. So look forward to that. We will talk at you then.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.